precious thing to be able to have someone that we can have that kind of confidence in, that we can trust no matter what conditions we might have to face. My oldest daughter's birthday was here just a couple of days ago, and Hallie had been wanting to get her sister a present. And it was hard rain that night, and it was very cold. Little Hallie had her hood up when we were walking through the parking lot and her head down. As soon as she said this to me, I felt the Spirit cover me. She did not understand what she said and just how much of a lesson there was in it. We were walking through that dark parking lot, and there were cars going very quickly, and some of them not paying much attention. And I kept telling her, "Stay close to me, Hallie. Make sure you keep a hold of my hand." She had a tight grip on my hand, and she had her hood up, and her little head was down. And she was walking right beside me, real tight, pressed up against my side, holding my hand. We got about halfway through that parking lot, and cars were flying around us, and the rain was coming down. It was very uncomfortable. And I'm going to add a few words to make sense of what she said, though you parents would probably be able to put the language together to understand what she was getting at. But she said, "Daddy, I know that I'm going to be okay crossing this parking lot, and that I'm going to get to our van as long as I hold on tight to your hand and keep as close to you as I can." And these were her words. She didn't spiritualize it. I did. She said, "I cannot see where I'm going. I can't lift my head because the rain hits me in the face." She goes, "But you're so strong, Daddy. You can stand there with the rain hitting you. You don't have to look down. You're walking right into that rain." She goes, "And I know that if I just hold on to you, I'm going to get where we're going." You want to know what I felt when I heard that from that little girl's mouth? You want to know about I can trust Jesus. Do you know that's what it's about, saints? There's times in the cares of life are just beating us from every side. Conditions, things we don't know the answer to. We don't know how in the world we're going to resolve some of the things that we have to face. And even when we can't lift our head and see the target, even when we can't lift our head and even see where we're going, it's so confusing and so much is coming from every side. If we'll hold His hand and stay close to His side, He'll lead us every step of the way. That's what it means to trust Jesus. To stay right close to Him, to stay right in His keeping. And not to lean, as the Scripture says, unto our own understanding. What touched me the most about my youngest daughter making that statement is she's very independent. She is not one of those people that wants you to show her how to do something. She might watch, but she doesn't want you to take her through the process of how to do it. She just wants to do it. So she's not one that wants to hold your hand necessarily when you're walking through a parking lot. She knows where she's going, and she wants to just kind of go. But that was such a precious lesson to me, and it's an example of how God Himself works. He can face the tempests and the storms of this life, and if you hold His hand, you'll make it through. We do have a lot of tempests that we have to deal with. We do have challenges of life, don't we? But there is nothing that we will ever have to face that God cannot bring us through. God has been with us. We've had challenges. We've had crises that we've had to face. But I told you here Friday night when we talked on the doctrine of the resurrection, that word crisis, which comes from the Greek word krisis, doesn't always mean something bad is going to be the result of the crisis. We face a lot of things that are crises in our life. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that crisis has to turn out for the bad. Sometimes a crisis is an event you go through that when the process of that crisis is finished and the challenge has been met, you get onto the other side of that in a better place than you began the process. And that's part of how God works in the middle of crisis. You know, He's bigger than any crisis we might face. We've been talking about it here quite a bit lately, about the crisis of conscience that's going on in our nation right now. You know, we're having a crisis of conscience. The conscience of this nation is going to be either enlivened or seared. You can have your conscience seared. That means it becomes so numb that nothing can touch it anymore. And once a conscience has been seared and it's not able to be affected by anything touching it, that person can do almost anything and not feel guilt. Can make almost any kind of choice and not feel any twinge in their conscience because their conscience has been cauterized. We're in a nation right now whose conscience has been just about cauterized. Just about hardened and calloused over to the point where I'm not going to go through, I don't intend to, teach a lesson on it. But there's a whole series of things that happen that cause that to come about, you know. Little decisions. I mentioned here in one of our last services about the little foxes that spoil the vine. There's little decisions that people make that one after another slowly harden them. When I'm talking about someone cauterizing your conscience, you know what it means to cauterize something.
flame or something else is brought onto that until it literally numbs that area. It closes it up. It hardens the skin, and it causes it not to be able to feel any sensitivity. You can have your spirit cauterized. You can have things happen to you, and sometimes you don't even know they're happening. Sometimes we have no idea when we make some of the decisions we make how that can change us, how that can affect us. And it's usually little things. It's usually just a little bit at a time until finally you've come to a point where you really can't feel much anymore. That's a dangerous place to be when your conscience has been seared. Because a seared conscience is going to take a tremendous amount of surgery to remove this hardened part of that in order to get back to a tender area. It'll take some surgery. It'll take some really painful experiences to take you from a place where your conscience is seared. It'll take some very painful experiences once your conscience has been seared to be restored back to tenderness. And then, God forbid, you leave that conscience seared long enough that it creates within you a reprobate heart. There's stages, I said, and that's the stage you can reach before God just cuts off His interaction with you. You get a reprobate mind, a reprobate heart, which essentially means you have so dug your heels in, it will require a power bigger than you to get you out of that condition. If somebody is reprobate, that means they've gone to a point where they cannot, by any choice, turn their direction. They've so fastened themselves in a certain direction, they can't even turn. But there's a process when God wants to have somebody that He can take you through that'll slowly start to break up that hard callus over your heart. He slowly starts to affect change on you again and eventually get you to a place where He can touch you and He can affect change. And He can redeem even somebody who is dancing on the razor's edge of being reprobate. And He'll redeem a world that's reprobate. Do you realize this world is reprobate? En masse. You know what en masse means? That means as a whole, the vast bulk. This is not a godly world, saints. This is not a godly generation we're in. We're in one of the most ungodly generations. It's been on my mind heavy lately. I've been talking about it a lot. We are in one of the most perverse generations this world has ever seen. Not only perverse because of things they're doing, there may be some things they're not doing that past generations have done, but that was usually pockets of extreme perversion going on around the world. Now the world, as I've said here in the last few weeks, is so connected that when perversion begins, Sister Tina talked about these little things, just one little piece of the body, just one little part that has sin into it, it will corrupt and disease the entire body, won't it? Things move with almost the speed of light around this world. It takes almost no time for something to pass from one place to another in terms of messages, information, ideas, and other things that stimulate the mind of man. And stimulation in a negative and a carnal way is what will eventually produce a diseased heart, a reprobate state. So we're in a world that's going to have to be corrected at some point. It needs a pure form of government, and it needs a permanent form of government. We just hear this last week. We just went through in our nation the process of changing the guard. Sometimes the guard is changed and sometimes the guard stays the same. By that I'm talking about the electoral process. We just had an election in the United States, a midterm election, where there was an opportunity for those that voted to change the guard. If they didn't like what somebody was doing, they didn't like a certain party's stance, they didn't like how they were being represented, they could vote to change the guard. And it does appear that we've had a pretty dramatic changing of the guard in terms of the change of the balance of power in terms of the two. Now that balance of power has shifted pretty dramatically. Saints, our hope is not in the shifting of the balance of power in the political realm. Our hope is in the shifting of the balance of power in the spiritual realm. Thank God when things happen in the political realm that do bring more of a protective covering over values that we have. Thank God for things that might happen in the political realm that cause the people of God to not be in disfavor, to be in favor for a while longer, because, saints, one way or another, the people of God will be in disfavor. We're not going to stop that. One way or another, the people of God are going to have to face a system in this world that has become what the Scriptures refer to as a beast. Does a beast sound like a friendly thing? You know, there's a difference in the Greek words that are used for the four beasts in Revelation 5 and the beast in other passages like Revelation 13. Those aren't the same words. It's unfortunate they translate them in the same way. The one in Revelation 5 actually means a living creature. It doesn't tell you anything about whether it's a carnivorous or omnivorous or whether it's a vegetarian. It tells you nothing about that. A living creature can be a thing that can be good or bad. But a beast is a carnivorous, aggressive animal. And even the Greek word that's translated beast there represents a carnivorous, tearing, flesh-eating animal. We're in a world right now that is going to get worse. There can be things that will happen that will stunt the process of that and slow it down. But this world is going to get worse until it gets better. It is going to get better. But it has to get worse before it gets better. Sometimes sicknesses are like that, aren't they? You ever been sick with a fever or something else that had to reach its peak before you'd start to heal? It had to reach its peak before you start to recover. That's what I said here Friday night as well about this word crisis. It's interesting that one of the definitions of the word crisis in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary is a place at which a fever or sickness reaches its critical point. And at that point, it's either going to go into a place where it's going to bring possible death or you begin to recover from it. It either goes into a worse state where it'll destroy you and there's no coming back from it, or it goes into a better state where you're delivered from that sickness or condition. Now, this world is at a crisis point. We're at a tipping point right now. This world's standing on the edge of something. But that isn't, as I've said many times in our local services, that is not something that ought to cause you to be afraid. That's something that ought to cause you to realize there's a God on the other side of this crisis who's going to have His will and His way. And whatever crisis the church may face, whatever crisis this nation may face, there's a bigger God than any crisis. And all things work together for good to them that love God. That's part of what's necessary if you want everything to work together for good, you know. All things are not going to work together for good to them that hate God. All things are not going to work together for good to them that are non-engaged, to those that have no feeling whatsoever about God. They don't care one way or the other. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are the called according to God's purpose. God has a purpose. And those people that are part of His purpose are the ones that ought to love Him more than anyone else on this earth. If you've been called of God, you ought to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. You ought to love God with all you've got. If He's deigned to step down low enough to call you, you ought to love Him with every ounce of your being. And the more you love God, the greater submission you'll have to His will. Because if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, Jesus said, didn't He? The greater love we have for the Lord, the easier it is to serve Him. I started saying here a few minutes ago, there is nothing this world needs greater than a permanent form of government. We have changed the guard many times, but it's not a permanent form of government. You ought to be glad it's not. A lot of times people think, if I can just get the right people in, then let's just stop voting. You do realize there was several very prominent people in the financial world and in the world of celebrity, which means nothing to me, made statements about one of our presidents in this country that it might just be better if we gave him enough power that he could just do what he needs to do without needing to go through Congress. If it's your person that's in power, you might think that's a good idea. We've got somebody who has my values. We've got somebody who wants to do things the way I want them done. Let me tell you a little problem, though, when it's a human leadership. Even if they start with your values, when you give that level of power to anybody, power does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When you give that level of power to any individual, even if they start with your values, there's a point at which they're going to want to consolidate and hold that power and never lose it. And then they're going to have to do some things that could be very threatening to you, regardless if they started with your values. But there is going to be a permanent form of government on this earth. It will not be any of the political systems that are on this earth right now. And there has never been, saints, an entirely and wholly pure form of government on this earth, but there will be. There's going to be a form of government that's both permanent and pure that's going to be established on this earth. No political corruption. And I want to stress, we have had a changing of the guard this last week, but that didn't remove political corruption. We can change the guard 100 times and it's not going to take the political corruption out of the system. You know why? Because it's human beings with carnal, fallen natures that are the ones in those positions of power, and the more power they get, the more corrupted they'll become. You're never going to remove political corruption by changing the guard. It's going to take the king returning with his bride to rule and reign over this earth. There will be a city established in this earth, and you realize in the Bible a city is a picture of a government. It's a picture of a system of some kind. That's what it means when it uses some of this language like it uses in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. It's the 9th and 10th verse, I think, where it's talking about Abraham, and it said that he was looking for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. What kind of city do you think Abraham was looking for? Do you think he was looking for a larger metropolitan area? Do you think Abraham was looking for a physical city that God physically built? You know how I ask questions, so that's actually a yes and a no, because initially, no. Because God hadn't put a physical city on this earth. There wasn't a physical place where God's government was set. That's why it said that Abraham was looking for a city. Abraham had just come from a part of the world that was probably one of the most civilized parts of the world in terms of population and a metropolitan area in the area of Mesopotamia. When he came from Ur of the Chaldees, that was one of the largest cities in that part of the world at that time. If Abraham was looking for a city, why in the world would he leave that big city in Mesopotamia and go on over to Canaan, where things were much more rural than they were urban? Because Abraham wasn't looking for a physical city. Abraham was looking for a place where God's government would be set. God's order would be established on the foundation that God Himself laid, and that everything on that foundation was built by the God of heaven Himself through the agent of His precious Son Jesus. The foundation that God has laid in this earth is the same foundation we were singing about in this beautiful song. It is His Son Jesus. He said to the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, I lay in Zion for a stone, a sure foundation, a precious cornerstone. He that believeth will not make haste." There won't be any need to be worried. There won't be any need to be concerned. There won't be any need to feel anxiety, because when that stone is laid, you can build your life on it and never worry again. You can trust in Jesus. Praise His holy name. That was Peter's encouragement in 1 Peter 2, when Peter used some of the same language that's used in the Old Testament regarding that stone. A stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Well, it's a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to those that won't accept it. But for those that accept it, it becomes a great foundation stone you can build your life upon. Aren't you glad we can trust in that foundation stone? In a day where there's constant change going on. Thank God for a foundation that does not move. An immovable foundation that God Himself has laid. You can see some more examples of that language in the 12th chapter of Hebrews. 12:22 is another example, talking about the very same city that Abraham was looking for. Here in Hebrews 12, it tells you what city they were looking for in Hebrews 11 and 13. You want to find out what city he was looking for? You want to find out what kind of a governmental structure, what kind of an order? You are come unto the Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, the general assembly, and the church of the firstborn. And all those ones who are part of the church of the firstborn are those who are written in heaven. The 13th chapters. There's no continuing city. Greek word that's translated continuing is meno, and it means something that will abide, something that is put in place and never moved. Now look, saints, there hasn't been a continuing city yet. Do you know we are looking for a city just like Abraham was? Now we've seen pieces and parts of it. God is putting a city together in this world right now. We're part of that city. But we haven't seen the whole thing yet. Do you realize the early church was a flash of the city of the living God? A flash of Mount Zion. A little window into what it looks like when God Himself is working through a church, and His order and His Spirit and His Word is flowing in a powerful way. There was a flash of light there in the first century, and that time of that church slid away into the Dark Ages, fell away. We're not looking down through the history of the church. If you were to buy a book on the history of the church and read what happened in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century and in the 4th century, and on into the centuries that followed, and all the different splits and divisions and problems, and even what might be considered by some successes that the church had through that period of time, Do you realize that's not the historical record we're looking for to find the city of the living God? We're not going back through a book of church history and trying to say that was always the city of the living God. We're still seeking a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. The foundations of the city we want, saints, is built back in the first century. The foundations of the city we're trying to recover, to brush off all the detritus that's come upon it, all the debris that's covered it, is that first city that was built. You know, there's going to be a city again, and it is going to be an abiding city that will never change. It won't divide into denominations. It won't separate into splits. There won't be different laws all in the same. Listen, how common sense this is. What kind of city of God would it be if there were different laws in the different boroughs of the city? In the city of New York, it's made up of boroughs, you realize, different sections. What if in Brooklyn you were allowed to do certain things that you were never allowed to do in Queens? What if you could break a very serious law in Queens as long as you were on that side of the line, but if you did it in Brooklyn, you'd be in jail? What kind of city would that be? Could you argue it was one unified city? No. It means you'd have to have different sectionalized pieces. God is going to have one church again, saints. One church whose bloodline goes back to the early church, because there was one church when those men walked out of the upper room. There was only one church. There were one people. One place where God's name had been written. God is going to do it again, saints. Once God restores a church, God is going to begin restoring government on a larger scale than just the church. He's going to start restoring it back to this world. It will be preceded by God restoring a church. He'll restore a church. He'll produce a bride. He'll restore this world. I had a question from somebody that didn't understand the description of the New Jerusalem made in Revelation. They said, is it a city of some kind? Is it a group of people? Is it some kind of system of government? What is that exactly that is described as the New Jerusalem? Because in Revelation 21, it seems to describe a city. There's a lot of details about the walls and the streets and the gates. But it also says that she's prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And just 2 chapters before that, the 19th chapter, we see a marriage supper. And there's a bride made up of people. You ought not to get confused when you read some of those statements in Bible prophecy. That's one that I hope I can give you a simple answer to. I've said this before. We use this kind of language ourselves when it refers to the place of government. Do you realize how often people say the statement, Washington is corrupt? Now, what do they mean by that? There's some disease running rampant through the city of Washington? There is. They don't mean it literally. What do we mean if we say Washington is corrupt? We're not just talking about the physical city, are we? We're talking about a group of people that are in that city that we are referring to as Washington. When we say Washington is corrupt, we're talking about the government that is seated in Washington that might have corruption in them. You realize when we talk about the New Jerusalem, we're talking about the system of government and order that God has that's made up of a bride. That's why she's prepared as a bride adorned for her husband, because that's God's system of government that has been perfectly prepared, perfectly put together, seamlessly woven together as a pure and permanent form of government for the world to come. Wouldn't you like to have a permanent form of government that would be a pure form of government? Can you imagine what it would be like when there will be people who cannot make the wrong choices? Because no matter how good of a politician that you elect in this world, they still have the potential to make wrong choices. Do you realize God's going to have a government in this world who cannot make wrong choices? They're going to be so led by the Lamb that they'll follow Him whithersoever He goeth. That whatever words He speaks will be their words, just like Jesus was of God. When you see me, you see the Father. What you're hearing me say, not one word of it originated with my own thinking, with my own intellect, with my own understanding. Everything I say was given me to say by the Father. Everything I do was authorized and commissioned by the Father. We get this statement once in a while in the political arena when a large group wins, and sometimes they make this statement. They've got a mandate now, which is to say they believe that means the people are so behind them that whatever their views are, the people are commissioning them, giving them the authority to carry out those views. Do you know God's given somebody a mandate? Do you know He's given His Son Jesus a mandate? Where do you think greater power and a greater mandate would be received, from below or from above? As wonderful as the democratic system is, the mandate, at least to this point in our society, comes from below. You get elected or unelected based on the mandate of the people. Do you realize there's a lot more power when God is the one that's making the decisions than if we make the decisions? A mandate that comes right out of third heaven. A commission that comes right from the throne of God. Not what we want to do, but what God intends to do and what God is intending to carry out. And He is going to have His will in this earth, saints. He's going to have His will. He's going to have a system of government set up on this earth to judge this world in righteousness. We look at a world around us that's so confused right now. This present generation who, unfortunately, I'm talking about the leadership in this present generation of political figures, unfortunately has the misconception that they have answers that nobody else has ever had. They've got wisdom that nobody else has ever had. They've got understanding that nobody else has ever had. And if you just allow them to take care of things, they'll fix all the problems of this world. And that is never going to happen, saints. This world's in a bigger mess than it has ever been. I heard one of the representatives and one of the leaders make a statement that we're in a state of stability and peace in this world like we've never been. And I thought to myself, are you looking out your window? What fantasy world are you living in? Greater pressures are going on in this world than it's ever been. There is no peace without the Prince of Peace, saints. There is no government that will ever stand in any permanent form until that pure and perfect government of God descends down out of heaven. There is a government that's going to be set up throughout the millennial reign that's going to slowly become that government that is never going to be moved. Talked about this Friday as well in Revelation 20:4 through 6 when it talks about the first resurrection. And it begins that phrase by saying, I saw thrones and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. Until those thrones are set up in this earth and judgment's given unto them, we are always going to have a corrupted and confused situation, saints. It's one of the great reasons for the work of the church today is we are trying to build something that can produce the kings and priests of the world to come. Every single church has a mandate of some kind if they're called of God. They might have a mandate even if they're not. It just depends on who the mandate comes from. If the mandate of a church comes from a man-made council or a man-made group or some man-made founder, then that mandate doesn't mean much in the divine realm. But if you've got a mandate from God, you have a purpose, don't you? Churches in this world have different mandates. Do you know what our mandate is? If you don't, for anyone that's newer to this assembly, you ought to know what our mandate is. You ought to be able to write it down. After I got up to more of executive type positions in companies, they would expect you to know their mission statement. They would expect you to know what they're about. Especially if you're a manager or above, they would expect you to know the mission statement. Know what their intention was. Know what their goals were. Shouldn't you think that'd be a wise thing for anybody that's going to be a leader to know what the goals are? Know what we're trying to do? Whether you achieve this or not, everybody that God has called to this assembly has been called to a place where the mandate is very, very clear. The mandate is to build a body that can produce a bride. Now, we don't build it by ourselves. We surrender to the chief architect. We follow his design pattern. We invest ourselves at whatever level we need to invest ourselves to be able to do his will. And he builds through us. There's 1 Peter 2 again, when it says, to whom coming, referring to Jesus, as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious, ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, that we might offer up spiritual sacrifices to God through Christ Jesus. The reason he's building us up into a house is because he's got a sacrifice in mind. He's got an offering he wants to offer up. The bride of Jesus Christ is going to be lifted up so that the world can see the product that God intends to produce. And when he produces that product, he'll have in place the constituent pieces of what will become the government of the world to come. Second chapter of Daniel, right after Nebuchadnezzar had had this strange dream about the image and did not understand that dream, he had no comprehension whatsoever. Finally, Daniel was called, and Daniel had an insight into that dream and understood what it meant. And there's several beautiful phrases that he said before he began to interpret the dream, but one of them has always been one that I have held to, and that God is capable of changing anything he wants to change. Any leadership, any governmental systems, any political systems that stand in this world have no power to resist the exercise of God's power. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and might are His. He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings, and He setteth up kings. He removeth kings, and He setteth up kings. It doesn't matter what the kings of this earth do, because God can take them out anytime He chooses. It doesn't matter what the political bobbleheads of this present generation decide to do or say. God removes kings, and God sets up kings. God puts into power who He chooses, and He takes out of power who He disabuses from that position. God does what He wants in the realms of man. One of these days, He's going to take out all the systems of government and set up new systems of government. Over 5 chapters later, in the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel, start in the 9th verse, I beheld till the thrones were cast down. The Hebrew word can mean to throw something down or to push it into place. To push it out of place or to push it into place. To set it up or to tear it down. Isn't that strange? One word can mean both. So some people believe that means I beheld until the thrones were set up. Some people believe it means I beheld until the thrones were cast down. You know, it doesn't make any difference because He's going to have to tear some thrones down before He sets some up. You know that God is going to remove the political systems of this world. He is going to change the political systems of this world and set up a new system of government on this earth. And I'm not talking about through human revolutionary change. I'm talking about through divine action right out of third heaven. I'm talking about Jesus Christ our Lord returning with power and glory and with His bride beside Him to rule and reign over this earth. I beheld till the thrones were cast down or set up. And there'll be thrones cast down before there's thrones set up. And the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was as white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. Fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the judgment was set, and the books were opened. I'm going to skip down to the 13th verse. I saw in the night visions, and one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and was brought near before Him. And there was given Him dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, that not just His people, because all people will be His people when He's done. Aren't you glad you're already His? Aren't you glad you're already His? One of these days, all people are going to be His, because all people, nations, languages, if it wasn't big enough to say all people and someone wanted to try to say that didn't mean everything on the earth, all nations, all languages are going to serve Him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and His kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Every political system that has ever existed on the face of this earth has either deteriorated and disappeared or been destroyed and disappeared. The great kingdoms of the world represented in that image of Nebuchadnezzar, all of those kingdoms, with the exception of that little crumbly clay and iron that's still remaining, have long gone into the pages of history. Long gone back to the dust. Babylon is gone, saints. That great empire that was in Mesopotamia. The Medes and the Persians have gone back to the dust as far as their great empire they had in the times before Alexander. The great Greek Empire not only has gone, but look at what's left of Greece now and the terrible financial straits they've had to deal with. The Greek Empire has collapsed and gone into the pages of history. The Roman Empire, though both the Greek and the Roman Empire still have a lot of effect on the Western world in terms of their influence, of their culture and ideology, they are gone into the pages of history. All that's left is the developing feet of that image. That iron and clay. But there's a little stone as well, saints. Cut out of a mountain without hands, it says in Daniel 2:45. After Daniel went through that prophecy and explained what it meant, he got down and he said, and I saw a little stone cut out of a mountain without hands. And that little stone struck the feet of that image. All that long history of carnal human rule, dictatorships and kingdoms and other political systems that had existed all through time, that had often been a bane against the people of God. That little stone struck the feet of that image, and that image went to the ground, and the remainder of that was blown away like the chaff on a summer threshing floor. Taken to the four winds. Nothing left of the carnal systems of this terrible world. And that little stone planted itself as a foundation in this earth and started to grow. That little stone's going to grow for 1,000 years, saints. Do you know how big it's going to be after it grows for 1,000 years? It's going to cover the whole earth. That little stone is going to become the government and order of God that spans from sea to shining sea, and I'm not talking about North America. I mean from the Pacific to the Atlantic. This whole globe is going to be under the covering of that little stone. Under the covering of that authority it's represented, that power, that order that's represented by that little stone. And notice the language in the 14th verse of the 7th chapter. There was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom. Jesus is going to take the throne of his father David, and that throne is going to be a throne that's going to rule over the entirety of this earth. God talks about how he's going to judge the nations through that agent. It's one of those examples that are a very simple thing to understand if you just get one simple point and let it ruminate in your brain long enough to fasten somewhere. You know, that's what has to happen. You've got to let some thoughts ruminate. Down at the very end of this 7th chapter, I think it is, of Daniel, Daniel says that he was in the cogitations of his mind. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me. Have your cogitations ever troubled you? I guess you have to know what cogitations are before you can answer that. Have you ever cogitated to the point of anxiety? You're all grinning. Do you know what cogitation means? Thinking, ruminating in your brain. Daniel heard about some of this and he thought, look at some of the things that are going to happen on this earth. Look at the terrible beasts that are going to rise. Dreadful and terrible, one of the last of those beasts he described was. Look at some of the incredible activity. Imagine what it's going to be like to look into the glory realm and see God the Father, the Ancient of Days, seated on his throne in the midst of that great fiery ring of power that surrounds him, and to watch one like the Son of Man approach the Father. Here in the last few verses, as for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance was changed in me. I was thinking about this and troubled in my mind, and my countenance changed. I was shaken by it. I was a little anxious about the situation. But you know what he says at the end here I think is so important? It's the same thing that Mary said when some of the great things are being revealed to her. This glorious role of her son was being revealed to this young lady. And the statement was she pondered these things in her heart. It was too big for her. You know, some things are too big for us. And when it's too big, just ponder it a while. Cogitate on it. Let the Spirit work it into the marrow of your mind. He said, my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. 96th Psalm, the last 3 or 4 verses. Say among the heathen that the Lord reigneth. The world also shall be established, that it shall not be moved. He shall judge the people righteously. Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad. Let the sea roar and the fullness thereof. I started giving you some of these scriptures the other week about the sea and how the sea represents mankind in a turbulent state. Do you realize one of these days, instead of the sea roaring in defiance, they're going to roar out praises and lift up the great God of heaven and His Son, rather than to roar in resistance? Let the heaven rejoice. Let the field be joyful and all that's therein. Then shall the trees of the wood rejoice before the Lord, for He cometh to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with righteousness and His people with truth. And you can go over just 2 chapters. 98th Psalm. Sing unto the Lord a new song, for He hath done marvelous things. His right hand and His holy arm hath gotten Him the victory. That is a very poetic and beautiful statement. Do you realize contained in the germ kernel of that first verse is the picture of Jesus having come to redeem His people? They had no idea what this meant when this psalm was written. They had no conception of the fact that Jesus was going to come and redeem them. Sing unto the Lord a new song. God has done marvelous things. His right hand, His holy arm, that's Jesus, has gotten Him the victory. The Lord hath made known His salvation. His righteousness hath He openly showed in the sight of the heathen. Wouldn't that be something? God Himself would make known His righteousness to this whole world. Won't that be something? Brother Lee's verse, I've heard him quote a number of times, that when the judgments of the Lord are in the earth, the world will come to know righteousness. They will learn righteousness. When the judgments of the Lord are in the earth, the world will learn righteousness. The people of the world are going to learn righteousness. He hath remembered His mercy and His truth toward the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all the earth. Make a loud noise and rejoice and sing praise. Sing unto the Lord with the harp and the voice of a psalm, with trumpets and the sound of a cornet. Make a joyful noise before the Lord the King. Isn't this interesting, this phrase, considering the other side of this in those passages we read the other week? Let the sea roar, and the fullness thereof, the world and all they that dwell therein. Let the floods clap their hands. Let the hills be joyful together before the Lord, for He cometh to judge the earth with righteousness. He'll judge the world and the people with equity. We're in a world where there is very little equity, saints. There is very little true justice. There is very little balance. There is very little justice in the sense of even a legal sense of justice. There's miscarriage of justice quite often, meaning that somebody is accused of a crime they didn't do and sometimes spends years in jail. There's miscarriage of justice in the other way, where somebody does a terrible crime and gets off on some little technicality. But there's a miscarriage of justice at an even higher level than just dealing with individual cases. There's the miscarriage of justice in the sense of what we've seen happen so often, unfortunately, in our nation. You know, justice, in the sense of the justice God intends to produce, is not produced through opinion-based judicial activism. Judges deciding they're going to, based on their opinion, tell you what the laws are going to be. True justice can never be based on opinion-based judicial activism, but only through judicial faithfulness to an eternally established principle and precept. The only true justice that can ever be gotten is when there has been an eternal standard of some kind that we're going back to determine what is just and what is not just. You can't decide that the changing whims of culture are going to determine what we agree upon as a society is just. In other words, what laws are passed. Do you realize in part in the Declaration of Independence they appeal to the laws of nature and to nature's God? In our present world, a lot of people will say, well, the laws of nature are why we need to change certain things. That isn't the only thing they appealed to was the laws of nature, saints. When they said the reason we have the right to be standing here is because of the laws of nature that should allow men to be free and because of the God of nature, nature's God. If all we follow are the laws of nature, saints, and we leave out nature's God, we will be in a very dangerous place. If all you want to do is follow the laws of nature, that's a pretty dangerous condition you're going to create in a culture determined to follow the laws of nature without the God of nature, without nature's God. When we take the God of nature, when we take nature's God, that just means the God of creation. When we take nature's God out and push the laws of nature in, we are going to forget that there are no laws of nature that will produce anything valuable without the God who created nature. You have to have both the laws of nature and the God who made those laws, because without the God, it's up to you to decide what the laws are. And that's what we're doing in our present day. There's so much to say about the society we're in right now, but there's some glorious things to say about what's coming. God is going to have His way in the realm of man. He has already given the power to His Son to carry this out. As that beautiful song says, when the Father leans over and touches the Son upon the shoulder and says, go bring my children home, son. There's coming a day, praise His holy name, when He's not only coming back to get His children, but He's going to come back with His children, and He's going to rule and reign, praise His holy name. And it will be an everlasting kingdom that will never be done away with. Let's go back about 9 Psalms, the 89th Psalm, the 19th verse. Then thou spakest in a vision to thy Holy One, and said, I have laid help upon one that is mighty. I have exalted one chosen out of the people. The very next verse says it's David, but do you realize these verses are far too big for just human David? These verses are only fulfilled to their fullest in the seed of David, in Jesus Christ. I have laid help upon one that is mighty. That's a strange way to word this in the King James Version, but it just means this. I have empowered a mighty one. The Tanakh, which is one of the Hebrew translations of the Bible into English, says, I have conferred power upon a mighty warrior. Do you realize that God has empowered His Son to rule and to reign? He's conferred power upon a mighty warrior. That word mighty one, where it says, I've laid help upon the mighty, is Gibor, which is the exact word that's used in Isaiah 9, where it says, the mighty God, the El Gibor. He has empowered a mighty warrior on our behalf, saints. He's empowered a mighty one. I have exalted one chosen out of the people, right out of the line of David, right out of the tribe of Judah. I have found David my servant, and with my holy oil have I anointed him. Now that physically happened when Samuel was led to David the shepherd and anointed that boy with oil. But the culmination of that anointing was in the antitype of David when Jesus, on the Jordan River, the anointing of God's power fell on him, and he began to grow in wisdom and in knowledge and in favor with God and men, and begin to accomplish God's will in terms of what his calling and mandate were. With whom my hand shall be established, mine arm also shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not exact upon him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. I will beat down his foes before his face, and plague them that hate him. But my faithfulness and my mercy shall be with him, and in my name shall his horn be exalted. I will set his hand also in the sea, and his right hand in the rivers. He shall cry unto me, Thou art my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. Also I will make him my firstborn, higher than all the kings of the earth. Do you know that's what Jesus' role is? He's going to rule over all the kings of this earth, saints. The firstborn of the great and holy God of heaven. You can go over to the 110th Psalm when David makes this statement in the Spirit that is applied to Jesus as well. The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou at my right hand. Do you know how many times in the New Testament the picture is described of somebody seated at the right hand of God? You know there's only one person who has the positional capability of sitting at the right hand of God. There's only been one person that was honored with that seat to be seated at the right hand of God. The man Christ Jesus, seated at the right hand of God, seated beside the Father in terms of authority and power. The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou at my right hand until I make thy enemies thy footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thy enemies. This is talking about the nation of Israel, but it ought to be talking about us as well. Thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. The people of God ought to be willing. If we're struggling with serving God, it'll be awfully hard for Him to use us in the day of His power. But if we're willing and open to being used of God right now, when He comes in the day of His power, if you're willing already and longing for that coming, my God, what kind of glory can He do through a people that are willing? Now, in its deepest sense, I personally believe this is talking about Israel, that when He comes in power, Israel's attitude toward Him is going to be changed and they're going to be turned back to their Messiah. In the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning, thou hast the dew of thy youth. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, both king and priest. The Lord at thy right hand shall strike through thy kings in the day of His wrath. He shall judge among the heathen. He shall fill all the places with the dead bodies. He shall wound the heads over many countries. That's the political leaders of this world when they're replaced by the king. He shall drink of the brook that's in the way. Therefore he shall lift up the head. You know that last little piece you and I can share in? Even before we have the ability, if we merit that, to sit and reign and rule with Him, we can share in the last little bit right now. You can drink of the brook that's in the way right now. You can drink of the brook that's in the way and allow your head to be lifted up. We had a beautiful prayer service starting this service here today. And the Spirit of God was just moving through this sanctuary here today. I watched several things happening that are critical to the life of the assembly and to the families of this church. And the Spirit of God just subtly sowed itself through the fabric of this service. Do you realize that you can drink of the brook that's in the way almost any time? That's the place where the Spirit of God is flowing. All you've got to do is just kneel down there and take a drink. And you know what it'll help you to do? It'll allow you to lift up the head. Once in a while, our head is downcast. Once in a while, we're bearing a heavy load. We're dealing with a lot of difficulties and a lot of strain and stress and concerns. Drink of the brook that's in the way. You know, Jesus himself is described as drinking of the brook that's in the way, and that's what allowed him to lift up his head. All the strain and the stress and the conditions he had to deal with, he was able to undergo because of his access to the power and the Spirit of the living God. And you and I are living in a generation, saints, where we have access, like they did in those days, right back into the wells of salvation from which that Spirit is flowing out. You and I can dip our ladle right into the well of salvation. You and I can take a deep drink out of the brook that's in the way. My God, saints, you ought to do it. I'm looking at a clock right now. It's almost 2:15. It might be a good idea to let everybody take a drink of the brook that's in the way.